In this lecture, I'll provide an introduction to employee selection. First, I'll begin with an overview of selection and a definition of employee selection, as well as what selection tools are. Then we'll move on to a staffing supply chain perspective of selection, and then on to the inferences we make during the selection process, and then finally on to some best practices when it comes to employee selection. So let's begin with that overview. So we can define selection as a process in which an organization determines which applicants or candidates will be invited to work in the organization. Now, ideally, selection works in conjunction with recruitment to attract and hire qualified applicants for vacant positions. Now, selection tools are what we use to actually select people, and these are part of a broader selection system. So selection tools can be referred to as selection measures, selection procedures, selection assessments, or selection tests. And for simplicity, I'll just refer to them as selection tools. Now, selection tools are used to measure the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, or KSAOs, and job-related behaviors that applicants possess in order to identify the best candidates for the job. Now, examples of some common selection tools that you might encounter include structured and unstructured interviews, work samples, personality inventories or tests, cognitive ability tests, and situational judgment tests. Now, these are just some common examples, and there are many other types of selection tools that we could focus on as well. So now let's talk about selection from a staffing supply chain perspective. So this is a framework that was proposed by Cassio and Bedreau in their 2011 handbook chapter. And so first we'll focus on what are referred to as talent flows. So at the very beginning of the talent flow, we can focus on the potential labor pool. These are people that don't yet have the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are necessary in order to be in our actual labor pool, but these are people that potentially, they have that potential to eventually end up in our labor pool. Now from there, we have people from that potential labor pool will then flow into our labor pool. Now our labor pool is what we draw on when we're recruiting for a particular job vacancy or position vacancy, and we want to draw people from that labor pool that have the relevant knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics into our applicant pool, so then we can select from that applicant pool. And so again, from this applicant pool, this is where we find applicants or candidates for further evaluation, and then ultimately those people that we deem to be the best fit or the most promising candidates or applicants, we're going to extend them job offers. And if they decide to accept that job offer, they then transition from being an applicant or a candidate into an employee or new hire. Now, we can also focus on, from the perspective of these talent flows from the potential labor pool to the new hires on the one end to the other end, we can focus on the staffing processes that are involved and then try to understand how selection fits into this from a staffing supply chain perspective. So when we talk about workforce planning, we can think about how we focus on what are the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that that labor pool might have, those people within that labor pool might possess, as well as the different economic conditions that might exist externally outside the organization, such as the unemployment rate and so forth, and how that might affect the labor supply we might potentially have access to relative to the demand we have internally for filling different positions with people with the proper talent or knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics. Now, recruiting, on the other hand, we can focus on taking people again from that labor pool and then bringing them into the applicant pool. Now, screening, which is part of the selection process, this is where we then take those people that have applied for a position or job vacancy, and then we determine which people meet the minimum qualifications, for example, and then we evaluate those people who have made it through the screening process with perhaps some more robust selection tools that we might deploy. And this is where selecting or selection comes into play. And through selecting and selection, this is where we ultimately identify those people that have the highest level of talent, or in other words, are going to be the best fit for our job vacancy or position vacancy that we currently have. And then ultimately, we're going to offer and close by extending that job offer, and then if the person decides to accept that job offer, bring them in as a new hire. So we're going to be focusing on, from an employee selection perspective, really screening and selecting, which you can see here. Next, we're going to move on to selection inferences. These are the inferences we make during the selection process. So we'll begin by focusing on the selection tool, which, if you recall, a selection tool can also be referred to as a selection procedure, a selection assessment, a selection test, a selection measure. We can use those terms interchangeably. Now, as you can see here, the selection tool is in a rectangle, okay? And this is because I'm trying to represent this as a measure here. Now, a selection tool is intended to tap into or assess a concept or construct, and in this case, it's the conceptual job domain. And here I've represented this concept or construct of the conceptual job domain with this ovalized shape here. And so again, what we're trying to do in selection is make an inference about the conceptual job domain, and specifically how well a particular applicant might be able to perform aspects of that conceptual job domain, and we're trying to make that inference based on how they score on a selection tool. Where again, examples of a selection tool include interviews, work samples, personality inventories or tests, cognitive ability tests, and other non-cognitive tests as well. Now, from that conceptual job domain, we're also interested in specifically conceptual performance within that job domain. Okay, so we're interested in what does it look like to do that job effectively and successfully. And as you'll note, this is also an ovalized shape here because this is another construct or concept that we're interested in measuring or assessing using our different tools and measures. And it is through a type of performance measure that we attempt to tap into or assess the conceptual performance domain. Now, examples of performance measures might include your supervisor ratings of job performance, as well as productivity indicators or measures, and maybe even things like customer service ratings or customer satisfaction ratings, depending on the type of job it is that you're focusing on. Now, typically what we're looking at empirically would be the correlation between scores on selection tool for a group of applicants, and then and then scores on a performance measure for that same group of people once they become employees. Or alternatively, we could pilot this by looking at just a current group of job incumbents or current employees and looking at the correlation between their scores on a selection tool and their performance measure. But really the inference we're trying to make here is this diagonal here. We're trying to infer from our selection tool scores which applicants are likely to have the highest level of conceptual performance should they be accepted onto the job. So this is really the inferential leap that we're trying to make here. And I want to point out that this is really inspired and adapted from a classic article from Binning and Barrett in 1989. So I also want to point out here how job analysis fits into this. And specifically, job analysis is really used to reveal the conceptual job domain. It's through job analysis that we can identify those tasks, duties, and responsibilities, or in other words, behaviors that are necessary for performing the job, as well as those knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics, which are those worker or human attributes that are needed for performing the job. And that helps us understand that conceptual job domain. Now, in terms of best practices for employee selection, I'll point out a few here. Now, first, I recommend making sure that a relatively recent job analysis has been conducted and that the job description and job specifications that come from such a job analysis are up to date, because we really need to know what the job entails and requires to know how to select. In other words, as we just saw in that previous framework where we were looking at those selection inferences, we really need to know how to define and conceptualize that conceptual job domain. Because once we do that, we can better identify specific things we need to measure from that conceptual job domain using our selection tools that we choose, develop, or purchase. So again, a best practice is to make sure you've done a recent job analysis. Next, you want to leverage the recruitment process to generate an applicant pool with a large number of qualified individuals who fit the position. Okay, so this means you really want your recruitment and your selection systems and processes to work closely and in tandem with one another. And then finally, we want to make sure each selection tool abides by prevailing legal and ethical guidelines and that it demonstrates high levels of reliability, validity, and utility. So just to wrap up, what we focused on in this introduction to employee selection was first an overview of employee selection, which included a definition of selection itself, as well as a definition for selection tools. We then moved on to a staffing supply chain perspective of employee selection, and then on to the selection inferences that we're trying to make during this process. And finally, we just ended up talking about 3 best practices when it comes to employee selection. So here are some references if you'd like to see what I was referencing throughout this presentation here. And then again, to conclude, this was an introduction on employee selection.